Uh, Now we would be starting with our webinar. I would request all the participants here to kindly keep their microphone in the mute mode. We have our guest speaker, Dr. Abhinav Chandrachud with us. Now we would be starting with our webinar. I welcome all the participants in this 12th edition of webinar organized by Jharkhand Legal Literacy Forum. I welcome the chairman, Jharkhand State Bar Council, all my seniors on the screen, off the screen, my colleagues, my friends. Friends, as you all know, that we have been organizing with this series of webinars in this pandemic period. Friends, he wrote his first book at a tender age of 26 years, and today he has 6 publications under his name. Being vocal about freedom of speech and expression and free living, it would not be an understatement to say that he is a true legal blue blood. Young Mr. effortlessly steers forward as a luminary with his acumen and grit without stumbling over the burden of his legal lineage. I talk of none but Dr. Abhinav Chandrachud, one of the most dynamic and opinionated person in the legal fraternity. And when I say opinionated, I suggest a positive connotation of being occurrent. I feel compelled to mention that Dr. Abhinav Chandrachud is the grandson of our very revered Chief Justice of India, Justice Yashwant Vishnu Rao Vishnu Chandrachud, and the younger son of sitting judge of the Honorable Supreme Court, Honorable Justice Dhananjay Yashwant Chandrachud. Dr. Chandrachud is a graduate from Government Law College, Mumbai. He has completed his post-graduation degree from the prestigious Harvard Law School and has placed another feather in his hat by receiving a doctorate from Stanford Law School. Even after belonging to a tremendously illustrious pedigree, Abhinav's demeanor conveys nothing but humility and composure. Dr. Abhinav Chandrachud has been making imprints over the media with his intriguing ideas about need for change in the perception of how our constitution confers freedom on each one of us. I would now request Dr. Abhinav Chandrachud to take over the podium from here and address the House on today's topic, affirmative action and the Constitution of India. Over to you, Dr. Abhinav Chandrachud.
Thank you, Rahul, for that very generous introduction. I hope that I'm audible to all of you. And thank you all for coming today and for attending this webinar. Of course, under different circumstances, I would have loved to be there among all of you. And hopefully, God willing, with the pandemic coming to an end in the near future, hopefully that day will come when I will be able to come and visit all of you and deliver this address in person. I'd like to, of course, welcome all the senior advocates, the chairman of the State Bar Council who is here with us, and all my friends, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for today's talk is affirmative action and the Constitution of India. And this is a topic which is always in the news, one seems to get the impression. For instance, if you look at the 103rd Amendment to the Constitution enacted only in 2019, which brought about a cataclysmic change in the notion of reservations. The 103rd Amendment is an amendment which for the first time gives reservations purely on the basis of economic criteria and is an amendment only for the upper caste poor. This is something that I will talk about during my address today. This very year, the Uttarakhand government decided to scrap reservations when it comes to promotions. And the Supreme Court reiterated the old idea that there is no fundamental right to reservations. Of course, in the recent news, we've seen that the Bombay High Court's judgment in the Maratha reservations case has essentially now been stayed by the Supreme Court. And we've also seen that the Supreme Court has referred the Constitution Bench judgment in the case of E.V. Chinnaya for reconsideration before a larger bench on the question of whether there can be sub-classification within the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe community as there is within the OBC community. So this is a topic that I thought would be an interesting one to discuss with all of you today, given that it is always relevant. Now, taking a step back, there are 201.3 million scheduled castes in the country and 104.5 million scheduled tribes, together constituting around 25% of the population of India. If you consider the size of the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe community in India alone, it is larger than the population of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Spain combined. So the population of the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe community in India alone is larger than the population of many of these European countries. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, of course, he's now a very unpopular figure, and justifiably so. But Winston Churchill was not wrong when he said, and I quote, "When one speaks of a minority as large as this, the word minority loses much of its significance." End quote. We can't run away from the fact that discrimination against marginalized communities is still very much prevalent in modern day India. Studies that have been published in the Economic and Political Weekly demonstrate that when a candidate applies for a job answering newspaper advertisements, he or she is more likely to receive a callback for an interview if that person has a Hindu upper caste sounding name. There is a higher likelihood of being invited for an interview. Social scientists have established this in papers that have been published in the Economic and Political Weekly. Social scientists have also established that landlords in Delhi are more likely to give out their premises on rent to those who have, or to tenants who have, names that sound like upper caste Hindu names as opposed to Dalit and Muslim names. So it is impossible for us to run away from the fact that discrimination is still faced by the marginalized communities in India, in modern India today. During the course of this talk, I hope to achieve a few objectives. I intend to discuss the differences or the evolution of the terminology scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, other backward class, socially and educationally backward classes, economically weaker sections, meritorious reserved candidates, and most backward classes. I hope to discuss some of the tests which have been formulated by the Supreme Court. For instance, the 50% rule, or the rule that reservations cannot exceed 50% of the total available seats. The concept of the creamy layer, and the rule laid down relatively recently that before reservations are instituted, the government must collect quantifiable data on certain parameters. I hope also to touch upon some of the crucial debates that revolve around the notion of reservations. For instance, whether reservations can be considered an exception to the principle of equality of opportunity, whether there is a fundamental right to reservations, whether quotas undermine merit, and how merit is to be defined, the concept of vertical and horizontal reservations, ideas like the carry-forward rule, the catch-up rule, consequential seniority, and whether reservations can be brought about solely on the basis of caste. I know that we do not have much time, and I've set out quite a few topics before you, but hopefully I will be able to cover or at least briefly discuss most of these topics. Now, let me begin with the question that the Supreme Court has asked itself repeatedly, especially in the early decades of the court's existence. You see, the Constitution in Article 16(4) uses the term backward class of citizens. It does not use the term caste or tribe. The question that the Supreme Court asked itself in the early decades of its existence was, what is the meaning of backward class of citizens under Article 16(4)? And does caste include class? Or would caste come within the concept or definition of class? And I will attempt to argue before you today that this question cannot be answered in the abstract, but must be answered by looking at the historical evolution of the terms scheduled caste and scheduled tribe in colonial India. You see, prior to this label or nomenclature, scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, backward communities in India, especially in colonial India now I'm referring to, were called the depressed classes. Now, the term depressed classes was a British term that was used in the United Kingdom to describe communities that were poor and downtrodden. So, for instance, in 1849, an American author wrote in a book of the depressed classes in Great Britain and Ireland. The term depressed classes was then imported into India, often by Christian missionaries who came here, or their children. So, for instance, in 1885, a man by the name of William Lee Warner, who was the son of a clergy member in England and a member of the education department in Bombay, used the term depressed classes to describe generally poor and downtrodden sections of Indian society as well. The important point was that the term depressed classes had no clear or precise definition in the 19th century. Around 1917, a Government of India official by the name of Sir Henry Sharp said that the depressed classes includes not merely those communities that would be considered untouchable, but also those communities that are backward or educationally poor, including Muslims. So this was not necessarily only a Hindu nomenclature. The census reports of 1901 and 1911 used the term depressed classes, but did not give it any precise connotation or definition. It was in my research for the first time in 1918 when a member of Parliament in the House of Commons by the name of Charles Roberts made a speech in which he said that the depressed classes in India are only those communities who have suffered from the stigma of untouchability. It was around that time that the definition of depressed classes started to change, and from being used to denote marginalized and backward communities generally, depressed classes was used to denote those castes within Hinduism which suffered from the stigma of untouchability. Incidentally, it was around that time, around 1918 or 1919, or 1917 rather, that the Congress party switched its gears and stopped treating untouchability as a purely social issue and made it a political issue. As Dr. B.R. Ambedkar wrote in his book published in 1945, entitled What the Congress and Gandhi Have Done to the Untouchables. It was in 1917 that the Congress passed a resolution for the first time acknowledging that political steps have to be taken in order to abolish untouchability in India. Until then, the Congress had refused to really consider untouchability as one of the issues that it would look into. And this was considered to be a social issue for the Social Congress, which met usually after the political Congress, the Indian National Congress. Ambedkar also was quick to point out that the chairman of the session in 1917 was Annie Besant, who in 1909 had argued against allowing untouchable children in upper caste schools, saying that, well, in Eton and Harrow in London, in these elite private schools, they're called public schools in England, but in reality they're private schools, the children of poor and downtrodden and marginalized communities would not be granted admission. And so the same rules ought to apply in India. So Dr. Ambedkar found it quite strange why the Congress suddenly switched gears in 1917 and decided to address untouchability as one of the planks on its political platform. And the answer Ambedkar gives is that, well, it was around that time that the Government of India Act was being debated, the act which was passed in 1919 pursuant to the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. And it was pursuant to that 1919 statute, the Government of India Act, that members of the depressed classes for the first time gained entry into the provincial legislative assemblies on the basis of a policy of reservations, by virtue of which the governors would nominate a handful of members from the depressed classes onto the legislative assemblies. So at around the time that the depressed class community in India gained political recognition, at around that time, the definition of the term depressed classes changed from being used as a broad term to denote backward classes generally into a term that was used only to denote those castes within Hinduism who suffered from the stigma of untouchability. So in 1921, the census said that a depressed class community was only a community which had suffered from the stigma of untouchability. And so did the 1931 census, which was quite an important census, prepared by a man by the name of J.H. Hutton. And Hutton said that was a census report that really defined how do you decide whether a community is untouchable or not. And Hutton came up with 3 criteria. He said that if a community is typically not allowed into temples, if it is not allowed to access water from wells or from the wells that are used by upper caste Hindus, or the children of those communities are not permitted into public schools, then that community will be considered untouchable, and therefore it will be considered a depressed class. Incidentally, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the chairman of the drafting committee in the Constituent Assembly, in the year 1900, when he was still a student in school, was made to sit separately in his English medium school in Satara. And at Elphinstone College in Mumbai, he was not permitted to study Sanskrit and had to study Persian instead on account of caste barriers at that time. Now let me get into the nomenclature of other backward classes, a term that has now become a fixed star in our constitutional constellation. This too was an English term, backward classes. In 1870, at the University of Oxford, an article was written which said that 2/3 of the students from the backward classes are studying here And by that, the article said, was meant the sons of squires, clergymen, and capitalists. So, in other words, unlike the term depressed classes, which in England was used to denote backward communities or extremely poor and downtrodden communities, the term backward classes in England meant middling classes or the middle classes. The term was once again imported to India. Since the 1880s, it was used in colonial India. And as a result of certain developments that took place in the province of Bombay, the term became quite well known. So, for instance, there was a controversy which took place in 1901 in the princely state of Kolhapur called the Vedokta controversy. Now, Kolhapur was a relatively small princely state of only 3,200 square miles, but it was considered to be quite important by the British because the dynasty that ruled Kolhapur was descended from King Shivaji. In around 1901, a Brahmin priest performed a thread ceremony for the royal family according to Vedic rites as opposed to Puranic rites. The Brahmin Panchayat at Kolhapur excommunicated that man on the grounds that the royal family of Kolhapur belonged to a caste which did not warrant Vedic rites but warranted Puranic rites. It was as a result of this incident that the prince of Kolhapur or the king of Kolhapur, Shahu Chhatrapati Maharaj, in October 1901 issued an order that said that the Vedic ceremonies have to be performed for the royal family. And in May 1902, he also issued an order penalizing the Rajopadhyay or the royal priest, the royal Brahmin priest at Kolhapur. Then Shahu left for England and something very interesting happened. In July 1902, Shahu Chhatrapati Maharaj, while he was in England, issued an order which said that 50% of government jobs in Kolhapur would go to, and I quote, the backward classes, end quote. Perhaps one of the earliest formal recognitions of the term backward classes and one of the earliest reservation policies in favor of not the depressed classes but the backward classes. And that July 1902 order said that the backward classes were all those communities apart from Brahmins, Prabhus, Shenvis, Parsis, and other advanced classes. When this order was published, the English newspaper of Lokmanya Bal Gangadhar Tilak, the newspaper was called the Maratha, said that this order puts caste over merit, perhaps one of the earliest invocations of the now famous merit argument in the context of reservations. At that time, 60 out of 71 officials in Kolhapur were from the Brahmin community, though they constituted only 4% of the population of Kolhapur. Now, all this had the tacit support of the British government. It's important to realize that many of the leaders of the freedom movement at that time, leaders like Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, M.G. Ranade in Bombay province, were upper caste Hindus. Governor Northcote, who was the governor of Bombay province, in fact, in his correspondence with the Secretary of State in London, took credit for the order that Shahu passed against the Rajopadhyay. Prior to the Vedokta controversy, Shahu had visited Mahabaleshwar, which was the summer capital of the British government in Bombay province. And Governor Northcote wrote to Secretary of State Hamilton in England, and I quote, we quietly instilled a little pluck into him, end quote. Shahu visited the Secretary of State George Hamilton in England just after the Vedokta controversy and prior to the July 1902 order. And it was Secretary of State Hamilton who said that Shahu ought to stand up to the Brahmins. So the non-Brahmin movement was at this time, of course, to the advantage of the British. The British had their own interests in these matters. Jyotirao Phule, who was a great non-Brahmin leader, was at some level, of course, anti-Brahmin, but at some level pro-British. For instance, Sri Jyotirao Phule said that the 1857 revolt in India was largely an upper caste movement. He suggested that the 10 avatars of Vishnu were actually an indication of an Aryan invasion into India. And the 10 avatars of Vishnu actually indicated the different phases in which the Aryans invaded India. And the Satyashodhak Samaj of Sri Jyotirao Phule encouraged its members to take an oath of loyalty to the British government. After all of this took place, a few decades went by, and a committee was appointed by the Bombay Provincial Legislature under the chairmanship of a member of the Indian Civil Service called O.H.B. Start. Now, O.H.B. Start in his committee also included a young legislator from Bombay province by the name of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. It was this committee that in July 1930 defined the term backward classes and said that backward classes means three things. One, the depressed classes. Two, the Aboriginal and hill tribes. And three, other backward classes. Perhaps the first time in our history that the term other backward classes or OBC was used in July 1930. And this is very much how the term backward class of citizens is now understood under Article 16(4) of the Constitution. It now includes the scheduled castes, that is the depressed classes in colonial India, the scheduled tribes who were referred to as the Aboriginal and hill tribes in colonial India, and the other backward classes, a term that was coined by the Start Committee with Dr. Ambedkar as one of its members. Now, interestingly, in May 1933, a few years later, the Bombay government asked itself an important question. It said, okay, the Start Committee says that there is some such group of people called other backward classes. But how do we define who will be within the other backward classes or not? And the Bombay government came up with the definition that the OBCs would be those communities that are at the same state of social and educational advancement as the depressed classes, whom we would now call the scheduled castes in India. And it was this definition of the Bombay government, that the OBCs shall be at the same stage of social and educational advancement as the scheduled castes or as the depressed classes, that gained currency in the Supreme Court and eventually was done away with, effectively in the judgment of Indra Sawhney's case, though it held sway with the Supreme Court in judgments delivered by Justice Gajendra Gadkar, notably M.R. Balaji's case, which I will hopefully be able to come to in a moment. So the short point that I want to make before I transition to the Constituent Assembly debates is that though the term class was used in colonial India, the term class was an import from Britain to India. There were obviously no castes in the United Kingdom. So the English language did not have a term that could appropriately be applied in India. And so terms like depressed classes and backward classes were imported from Britain into India. But when they were imported to India, they acquired their own unique meanings. So depressed classes in England was a broad term used to describe backward communities generally, whereas in India, it acquired a specific meaning of being those communities that suffer from the stigma of untouchability. And not by communities, I mean Hindu castes that suffer from untouchability. Similarly, backward classes in the United Kingdom was a term used to describe middle classes, whereas backward classes in India, under the Start Committee's definition, which really became the constitutional definition, meant scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other backward classes. So when the Constitution used the term class, when the framers of the Constitution used the term class in Article 16.4 of the Constitution, they used it as a synonym for caste or tribe. Now, skipping a little ahead, I will come to the Pune Pact, which forms an important backdrop to the Indian Constitution. You see, at the first roundtable conference which was held in London in the year 1930-1931, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who participated in the conference, asked for separate electorates for the backward classes or for the depressed classes. And by separate electorates, Ambedkar essentially meant that the voters must be segregated on the basis of their caste. Separate electorates used to exist for religious minorities, most notably Muslims. And in fact, it was long considered to be the sole reason, and it still is considered to be perhaps almost single-handedly responsible for the partition of the country. Let me tell you why. A politician like Jinnah, if separate electorates did not exist, would have had to get elected not merely at the hands of Muslim voters, but also at the hands of Hindu voters. And therefore, in a system where there were no separate electorates, moderate politicians would have been elected to office who catered to the wider community at large. But because leaders like Jinnah did not have to worry about what Hindu voters would think about their policies, they could advocate more radical viewpoints, such as the partition of the country along religious lines. So the Congress were naturally opposed to granting separate electorates for the depressed classes, which would have the effect of dividing the country even further. Now, what happened was that at the second roundtable conference, Gandhi attended as the sole Congress delegate in the year 1931. And because the delegates did not agree as to what the policy should be towards the depressed classes, and they were of course debating the law that became the Government of India Act of 1935, the delegates at the second roundtable conference, Gandhi included, decided to appoint an arbitrator to decide that question for them. And that arbitrator was Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald. Now, friends, you all know that when an arbitrator delivers a judgment, it is not called a judgment, but it is called an award. And that is where we get our term from history, the Communal Award, which was issued in 1932 by the arbitrator appointed by the delegates at the second roundtable conference, namely Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, which got the term Communal Award. And that Communal Award essentially said that the depressed classes would also get separate electorates. When Mahatma Gandhi realized that Prime Minister MacDonald had decided to give separate electorates in favor of the depressed classes, he decided to undertake a fast unto death. On 20th September 1932, his fast unto death began. And 4 days later, Ambedkar and Gandhi signed an agreement called the Pune Pact. Gandhi, of course, was lodged at Yerawada jail in Pune at this time, and the agreement had to be signed in Pune. And the Pune Pact essentially said, first and foremost, that there would be no separate electorates for the depressed classes. However, the depressed classes would get seats in the provincial legislative assemblies, which would be in proportion to their size of the population. However, though the concept of proportional representation was provided for under the Pune Pact as far as provincial legislative bodies were concerned, the Pune Pact said that the depressed classes would get government jobs, they would get reservations in government jobs that ensured fair representation, not proportional representation, but fair representation. The Pune Pact did not provide for any reservation in the cabinet, in the judiciary, that is in the higher judiciary, or in educational institutions. And by and large, this formula of the Pune Pact was carried forward into the constitution, which provided that there would be proportional representation for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in the now independent legislative assemblies in the state governments, but there would be only adequate representation, not proportional representation, for the backward classes in government jobs. Now, this, of course, was something that was carried forward from the Government of India Act, which really constitutionalized the Pune Pact. And let me now discuss briefly with you what I consider to be some of the salient or striking provisions of the Indian Constitution when it comes to reservations. First and foremost, the original formula in the Constitution was that there would be only two kinds of reservations. Reservations in government jobs under Article 16(4) and reservations in the lower house of legislative bodies, that is the Lok Sabha and the lower legislative assemblies in states that are bicameral. In other words, there was no reservation in the Rajya Sabha or in upper houses of state legislatures, no constitutionally mandated reservations in the cabinet, in the higher judiciary, in educational institutions. Mind you, that came about with the First Amendment. And most importantly, no reservations in the private sector, despite the fact that even at the time that the Constitution was enacted, only 0.7% of India was actually employed by the public sector. Though public sector jobs at that time were very highly prestigious and to some extent continue to be so in independent India today. As I've discussed with you earlier, the formula of the Pune Pact on quantum of reservations was carried forward into the Constitution, and that was that under Article 332 of the Constitution, scheduled castes and scheduled tribes would get the number of seats that would be reserved for them would be proportional to their population, and proportional to the population, not only the population of eligible voters within the population. On the other hand, Article 16(4) of the Constitution uses the term adequate representation for the backward classes, not proportional representation, which was akin to fair representation under the Pune Pact, which is the Pune Pact formula of proportional representations in legislatures and adequate representation or fair representation, something that falls short of proportional representation in government bodies. Now, in November 1948, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar made a very important speech in the Constituent Assembly, in which he said that reservations are an exception to the principle of equality of opportunity. And he gave the example that, look, if there are 100 seats in a government department, then 70 seats cannot be reserved, because that would mean that the exception has swallowed the rule. And therefore, Dr. Ambedkar said that reservations must be limited or confined to a minority of seats. At the time, only around 12.5% of the seats in government departments were reserved for scheduled castes. And perhaps that is what Dr. Ambedkar had in mind when he made that speech in November 1948. Even when Ambedkar appeared before the first session of the Round Table Conference, Ambedkar did not ask for proportional representation for the backward classes in government jobs, but asked only for adequate representation. Another interesting provision is that there is no reservations for other backward classes in the lower house of legislatures. This was not the formula prior to Indian independence. In the province of Madras, as a result of a very powerful non-Brahmin movement with the Justice Party at the helm of the affairs, non-Brahmins were granted reservations in the provincial legislature of Madras, and similarly Marathas were granted reservations in the provincial legislature of Bombay. But after the constitution came into being, reservations only extended to the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in legislative bodies, and of course with certain amendments to the constitution, OBCs have been granted reservations in lower bodies such as panchayats and so on. But the constitutional formula was, as far as legislatures are concerned, scheduled castes and scheduled tribes will get reservations. And as far as government jobs are concerned, they will be for the backward class of citizens, which includes not merely scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, but also other backward classes. Another interesting provision was the sunset clause in the constitution, which said that as far as political reservations are concerned in legislatures, they will come to an end 10 years after the constitution comes into being, while there was no such sunset clause as far as government jobs are concerned. And in fact, Prime Minister Nehru was often of the view that the difference or distinction between the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes on the one hand and the other backward classes on the other hand will cease to exist after 10 years, because they will all thereafter only be entitled to reservation in government jobs, and that there will only be reservations in legislatures for 10 years. When Prime Minister Nehru was asked, what happens when a person from a scheduled caste converts to another community? Nehru's answer was that, well, that person becomes an OBC, and the distinction between OBC and scheduled caste is going to soon go away, because we are going to have political reservations only for 10 years. Now let me briefly talk about the First Amendment to the Constitution. You see, in the year 1951, an interesting judgment was delivered by the Supreme Court in the case of State of Madras versus Champakam Dorairajan. The State of Madras had issued an order called the Communal Geo, or the Communal Government Order, which essentially granted reservations for all communities in the state of Madras and not merely backward communities. So there was some reservation in the government services in Madras, even for the Brahmin community. This was challenged under Article 29(2) of the Constitution, which says that no citizen can be denied admissions into educational institutions only on the basis of caste. In that case, there were of course two cases that came before the Supreme Court, Champakam Dorairajan and B. Venkatraman. Champakam Dorairajan's was a case concerning educational reservations, and Venkatraman was a case concerning reservations in public services. The Supreme Court said that as far as educational institutions are concerned, there is no provision akin to Article 16(4) in the Constitution, and therefore the Supreme Court doubted whether there can be reservations in educational institutions or not. Mind you, the principle laid down in Champakam Dorairajan's case, that there cannot be communal reservation for the upper castes or the upper communities, is still a principle that is considered to be a part of our constitutional jurisprudence today. However, as far as the Supreme Court in Champakam Dorairajan's case doubted whether there can be reservations in educational institutions, the first Parliament of India, which I'm sure many of you may know, was actually only the Constituent Assembly functioning as a provisional Parliament of India. At that time, it was a unicameral body. There was no Rajya Sabha. The first elections had not yet taken place. It was this provisional Parliament which issued the First Amendment, or passed the First Amendment, which inter alia inserted Article 15(4) into the Constitution, which says that the government can still make a special provision for the socially and educationally backward classes, and not economically. The important thing is that it does not use the term economically backward classes. Now, who are the OBCs or the socially and educationally backward classes? In 1953, a commission was appointed called the Kaka Kalelkar Commission, which was tasked with the responsibility of defining what this community consisted of. And the Kaka Kalelkar Committee came up with criteria that was so broad and so vague that they were hard to really apply. In fact, though the Kaka Kalelkar Committee relied on caste in order to decide who the other backward classes would be, in the forwarding letter that was written to the President of India, President Rajendra Prasad, Mr. Kaka Kalelkar said that we actually should not be using caste as a tool for determining backwardness. All this then became important when we come to the decision of the Supreme Court in M.R. Balaji's case, much of which held the field until the Supreme Court's judgment really in Indra Sawhney's case. What happened in M.R. Balaji's case was that the state of Mysore appointed a committee called the Nagan Gowda Committee to decide who the socially and educationally backward classes were. Now, the Nagan Gowda Committee came up with only one criterion for social backwardness. According to the committee, if a caste was considered to be low on the social hierarchy of castes, then and only then would it be considered to be socially backward. No other criterion was used for determining social backwardness. As far as educational backwardness was concerned, the Nagan Gowda Committee said that if a community or if a caste was lower than the state average in terms of its literacy, no matter how much lower, it could be even marginally lower than the state average in terms of its literacy, then it is automatically to be considered an educationally backward class. On the basis of the Nagan Gowda Committee report, the state of Mysore issued an order by which 68% of the seats in government departments were reserved for the backward classes, 50% of which were for OBCs, 15% for scheduled caste, 3% for scheduled tribe. And within the OBC community, there was a subdivision. 28% of the OBC seats were for backward OBCs, while 22% were for the most backward or the more backward OBCs. Now, what the Constitution Bench of the Supreme Court says when this comes up for consideration in the case of M.R. Balaji, with Justice Gajendra Gadkar writing the judgment for the court, is that caste cannot be the sole factor for determining social backwardness. Though scholars have said that this has changed now, in my humble opinion, this still remains the law in our country, because the Mandal Commission, as I will briefly touch upon in the coming minutes, did not use caste as the sole criterion for determining social backwardness. The Mandal Commission used caste as one of the criteria for deciding social backwardness. So when Justice Gajendra Gadkar said that caste cannot be the only criterion for social backwardness, that is still very much the law in the country. However, Justice Gajendra Gadkar also added that economic backwardness must be as important as social backwardness for defining who the socially and educationally backward classes are, or for deciding who the other backward classes are going to be. This has now changed. Economic backwardness is now not as important as social and educational backwardness, which are crucial. Justice Gajendra Gadkar also said that the Nagan Gowda Committee was wrong to decide educational backwardness purely on the basis of whether a community was even marginally lower than the state average. According to Justice Gajendra Gadkar, only if a community was substantially below the state average in terms of its literacy and education levels could the community be considered to be educationally backward. Then, relying on Dr. Ambedkar's speech in the Constituent Assembly, Justice Gajendra Gadkar said that the number of seats that are reserved for the backward classes cannot exceed 50%, which is how the 50% rule was born. Justice Gajendra Gadkar also said that the other backward classes can only be those communities that are as backward as the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. And I will remind all of you that this was precisely the definition of OBCs that was adopted by the Bombay provincial government in colonial India in 1933. And this holding of the Supreme Court then held sway for a very long time until the court really in Indra Sawhney's case says that no, OBCs cannot be as backward as scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, because otherwise it will be very hard to find any OBCs that can qualify for reservations. Justice Gajendra Gadkar also said that sub-categorization within the OBC community is not permissible, as the state of Mysore had tried to do when it tried to bifurcate the OBC community into backward and more backward. And this again held this way for a very long time until Indra Sawhney, where the Supreme Court, by a bench of 9 learned judges of the Supreme Court, held that sub-categorization within the OBC community is permissible. And now, in the recent past, a constitution bench of the Supreme Court in Dalvinder Singh's case has referred E.V. Chinnaya to a larger bench on the question of whether even the scheduled castes and scheduled tribe community can be sub-categorized on the basis of backward and more backward. Let me then come to the Mandal Commission report. The Mandal Commission was appointed in January 1979 by Prime Minister Morarji Desai. Mandal, of course, was a former Chief Minister of Bihar. And the Mandal Commission came up with a points system for deciding who the backward classes were going to be. On this system, social backwardness had 12 points, educational backwardness had 6 points, and economic backwardness 4 points. The Mandal Commission decided to use caste in 2 ways. First and foremost, Indian society, for the sake of administrative convenience, was bifurcated into castes. So caste was used by the Mandal Commission in order to categorize Indian society into different buckets or different communities. And so caste was used as a tool of administrative convenience. That was the first sense in which the Mandal Commission used caste. The second sense in which the Mandal Commission used caste was that one of the factors that were taken into account by the Mandal Commission for deciding social backwardness was whether a caste was considered to be low on the social hierarchy of castes in Hinduism. But these were not the only criteria for social backwardness. So for instance, if a large proportion of the members of a community had taken to manual labor, if a large proportion of the members of the community indulged in early marriage, or if many women, for instance, in a community had to enter the workforce, this we're talking about, of course, 1979, then that community was considered to be socially backward. So the Mandal Commission very much avoided the pitfalls and the mistakes made by the Dr. Nagan Gowda committee, as explained in M.R. Balaji's case, when it did not use caste as the sole criterion for deciding social backwardness. Even as far as educational backwardness was concerned, unlike the Nagan Gowda committee, the Mandal Commission report said that only if a community was substantially below the literacy levels of the state average would it be considered to be an educationally backward community. The Mandal Commission report also interestingly estimated that around 52% of the population of India consisted of OBCs based on the 1931 census, and for that reason recommended that there should be 27% reservation for OBCs on the basis of the rule laid down in M.R. Balaji's case, since at that point in time, only 22.5% of reservation extended up to the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, which would have left only 27% before the cap of 50% would have been realized. The Mandal Commission report was operationalized not when it was issued, because by then the Janata Party had been defeated and Indira Gandhi's Congress had come back to power, but in August 1990 under Prime Minister V.P. Singh, who issued an office memorandum saying that there would be OBC reservations in central government jobs for the first time. In 1991, when Prime Minister Narasimha Rao came to power, he also tried to institute 10% reservations for the economically backward communities. And it was these two office memoranda issued by the central government that came up for consideration before the Supreme Court in Indra Sawhney versus Union of India, the magnum opus which still holds the field today, bench of 9 learned judges of the Supreme Court. 6 different judgments were written in that case, spanning around 550 pages. But as we all know, when we get a matter to argue, we sometimes get a matter the night before the case comes up. So it's not possible to read 550 pages overnight. So we always try and find a way in which we can come to what the heart of the ratio is in the easiest possible way. And that, I would suggest to you, can be found by reading only one paragraph in the 550 pages. And that is paragraph 555 of Justice Sawant's judgment. Justice P.B. Sawant, of course, for 9 judges, you need a majority of 5 in order to constitute the majority. Justice P.B. Sawant, in paragraph 555 of the SEC report, tells all of us which are the paragraphs of Justice B.P. Jeevan Reddy's judgment that he agrees with. And Justice B.P. Jeevan Reddy spoke for 4 judges. So along with Justice Sawant and Justice B.P. Jeevan Reddy, you have 5 judges. So you know that at least these paragraphs constitute the view of the majority in Indra Sawhney's case. The majority held that caste can be an important factor, but not the sole factor for deciding social backwardness, which is precisely what was decided by Justice Gajendra Gadkar in M.R. Balaji's case. In Indra Sawhney's case, it was decided that OBCs do not have to be as backward as the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, because otherwise it will be impossible to find OBCs who are that backward. The 10% reservation that was sought to be provided by the Prime Minister Narasimha Rao government for the economically backward classes was also struck down on the grounds that social backwardness is crucial. Under Article 16.4 of the Constitution, backward class of citizens means those who are socially backward, and under 15.4, it means those who are both socially and educationally backward, not or educationally backward. But without social backwardness, you can't have reservations, and therefore the policy of economically backward reservations was struck down. Now, what the Supreme Court says in Indra Sawhney's case, and perhaps I'll shortly conclude, I know I'm running out of time, I'll shortly conclude with perhaps this thought, is that in Indra Sawhney's case, the Supreme Court says that Article 16.4 of the Constitution is no longer an exception to the principle of equality of opportunity. So the Supreme Court disagrees with the view that was taken by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Of course, this was not the first time this was happening. The great dissenting judge, Justice Subba Rao, in a judgment delivered in the 1960s called Devdasan's case, had also taken the view that reservations cannot be an exception to the principle of equality of opportunity. After all, equality of opportunity does not mean formal equality of opportunity, because treating unequals equally is also not considered to be a part of equality. And therefore, the Supreme Court says in Indra Sawhney's case that reservations under Article 16.4 of the Constitution are not an exception to the principle of equality of opportunity, but they are a part and parcel of the principle of equality of opportunity. Now, friends, if this is in fact correct, if this view taken by the Supreme Court is in fact a law of the country, in my humble opinion, 2 things ought to logically follow. The first is that reservations must then be considered to be a fundamental right. If reservations are not an exception to equality of opportunity, but are part and parcel of equality of opportunity, then there must be a fundamental right to reservations. And a person can seek a mandamus directing the government to institute a policy of reservations where a government refuses to do so, despite the fact that there may actually be a need for reservations. The second is that if reservations are not an exception to the principle of equality of opportunity, then the 50% rule must also go. This is because the 50% rule, or the rule that the total amount of reservation cannot exceed 50% of the total available seats derives its origins in the speech made by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in the Constituent Assembly, where Dr. Ambedkar said that because reservations are an exception to equality of opportunity, if you had 70% reservations, then the exception would swallow the rule. But if the exception no longer remains the exception but becomes the rule, then where is there any question of imposing an arbitrary cap on where reservations must end? And therefore, adequate representation must give way to proportional representation. Surely that can't mean 100% reservation, but it must therefore mean proportional representation, such that if the backward community extends to say 60 or 70% of the population of a state, then there can't be a cap of 50%, but the reservations must extend to 60 or 70%, as the case may be with respect to the backward classes. And finally, and I will now conclude with this, the Supreme Court says that the creamy layer must be excluded from the other backward classes in order for the office memoranda that were issued to be considered constitutionally valid. And over the years, in cases like Nagraj, Jarnail Singh, and the recently decided cases like Chebrulu and so on, the Supreme Court has applied the principle of creamy layer not merely to the other backward classes, but also to the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. And I think at some level, it is problematic to apply the concept of the creamy layer, especially to the scheduled castes. And that is because the basis of granting reservations for the scheduled castes under our constitution is not merely backwardness, but also that it is these communities, the scheduled castes, who were prior to independence called the depressed classes, who have suffered from the stigma of untouchability. Reservations are given to other backward classes and scheduled tribes because these communities are backward. Reservations are given to scheduled castes not merely because they are backward, but also because they have, and in some cases continue to, suffer from the stigma of untouchability. Now, to apply the concept of the creamy layer without investigating whether the stigma of untouchability has been fully wiped out or not is at some level unfair. And I'll give you only one example. This is an oft-quoted example in the speeches that are made in the Lok Sabha. There was a cabinet minister by the name of Jagjeevan Ram who belonged to one of the scheduled caste communities. Now, as a cabinet minister, Sri Jagjeevan Ram had certainly acquired creamy layer status, or what we would now call creamy layer status. Mind you, creamy layer status does not only come from economic criteria, it also comes from position and status. So let us say once a person becomes a Supreme Court judge or the President of India, then that person is considered to be creamy layer. When Jagjeevan Ram visited a temple in North India, some individuals decided to wash that temple with the water of the Ganges in order to quote unquote purify the temple. So in short, despite having acquired creamy layer status, a cabinet minister like Sri Jagjeevan Ram still suffered from the stigma of untouchability. So it is unfair, in my respectful opinion, to apply the concept of creamy layer, even in promotions, to the scheduled caste community without first having quantitative or quantifiable data to show that members of that community have now ceased to suffer from the stigma of untouchability. As I began by telling you, untouchability is still practiced in independent India. Social scientists have established this, though not perhaps in the traditional forms, in new and modern forms. I think that with that, I have come to the end of my allotted time. So I will conclude my discussion and I will leave it up to question and answers if there are any questions. Thank you so much once again for inviting me. Rahul, I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Abhinav, for such wonderful deliberations made this evening. You have flipped off the pages of history and have beautifully explained us the historical background of the reservation policy in India, the constitutional amendment, and the law laid down by the Honorable Supreme Court has been magnificently explained by you. We all present here are enlightened by the lecture given by you. Now I request the participants that if they have any query, they may either put it on the chat box. Better it would be if they put it on the chat box so that I can put the same to our guest speaker. Or yes, Mr. Bhanu Kumarji.
One query I am having. I just want to know something about this exception operating in the field of reservation in super specialty fields. In Indra Sawhney case also, some exceptions have been carved out. So I just want to enlighten us on that aspect. That also operates as an exception, that in the field of super specialty, there should be no reservation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bhanu Kumar, for that question. That's a very interesting question. And in fact, there's quite a fascinating judgment that was delivered by Her Ladyship Justice Sujata Manohar in Dr. Preeti Srivastav's case, which makes for very interesting reading. Because that judgment essentially says that at the levels of super specialization in the medical field, the nation will lose out if we have a policy of reservations. And the idea behind that judgment appears to be that at the very highest levels of education, there should only be excellence and merit. Now, first and foremost, I would argue that that presupposes that merit is defined neutrally. Whereas, as the Supreme Court has recently noted, there are many things that go into a person's merit, and merit cannot only be defined neutrally. In fact, the scholar at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, Mark Galanter, said that there are 3 criteria that go into whether a person has merit or not. The first is, and he was of course talking about coaching classes. So let's say that a person is giving an entrance exam for the law entrance exam, or let us say the new National Law School entrance exam. First and foremost, a person may succeed if that person has economic resources in order to avail of coaching classes and so on. The second is that a person may succeed if that person has access to social networks, if he's able to talk to seniors, ask them, what book should I study? How should I prepare? How do I improve my general knowledge for this exam? What kinds of questions come in the exam? And the third is that a person has merit if that person has intrinsic ability and works hard. Now, only one of those criteria is neutral, has nothing to do with the person's social upbringing and social circumstances. So in my respectful opinion, one can't lose sight of the fact that merit itself is defined contextually. Secondly, that judgment presupposes that the doctors who graduate from super specialized programs, let us say for instance, a person graduates as a pediatric oncologist. That is a very high level of super specialization. First and foremost, what is to ensure that that doctor will continue to practice in India? There is nothing to stop that doctor from leaving the country, attaining these very high levels of super specialization and leaving the country in search of greener pastures. So the nation may not necessarily benefit as a result of that. Secondly, what stops that doctor from practicing in the most expensive private hospitals in Mumbai and Delhi as opposed to practicing in rural areas? So can the nation really be said to benefit from this very highly super specialized doctor who is only charging very high levels of fees at the most exclusive and elite hospitals? So that judgment also loses track of the fact that social networks have some importance even when it comes to medicine. I in fact teach a course on affirmative action where I like to give this example. When I was studying in the US, I once wanted to see a doctor for some minor issue. But when I tried to get an appointment with a doctor, I was told that I'll be able to see a doctor 3 weeks later. Now, many of us have family doctors at home. We can pick up the phone and call up the doctor. That doctor might even advise us over the phone or on WhatsApp, or we can visit that doctor at short notice. So networks and connections have a role to play even in medicine. Now, if there are super specialized doctors from the backward classes, what the Supreme Court perhaps has lost sight of the fact is that, well, that opens up networks for people who belong to those communities who can then get access to medicine, which perhaps is something that ought to be considered. So these are very interesting issues, and I'm very grateful to Mr. Kumar for that question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Rahul, can I put a question?
Yes, Mr. Pandey Neeraj Rai. Please.
Good evening, Mr. Chandrachud. It was very nice to hear you, very enlightening. My question is, how do we reconcile this principle being laid down by the Supreme Court time and again, that there is no right to reservation, with the other principle that existence of duty, existence of a right, in the sense that the lawmakers, the government has a right not to provide reservation, or they have the right to provide reservation. How do we reconcile the two things? On one hand, citizens having no right to reservation. On the other hand, there is a public authority which is having a jurisdiction to do something. There are existence of facts which call for exercise of that jurisdiction, and that's not being done. So the principle that there is an implied duty with existence of power. I hope I'm clear with my question.
Sure, absolutely. So I think to answer your question, thank you once again for that question. To answer that question, I would say that I find it quite problematic that the Supreme Court equates reservations with something like the government's discretionary power to enter into contracts. So for instance, a private party has no fundamental right, or let alone fundamental right, even a right to argue that the government must necessarily enter into a contract with that private party. The law laid down by the Supreme Court is that well, the government must be fair in its process for determining who the contractor is going to be, but it's not obligated to enter into a contract with any person. The Supreme Court seems to apply the same logic to the reservations provisions of the Constitution by holding that these are only enabling provisions, and therefore there is absolutely no duty, there is no right inhering in any person, and there is no duty on the government to bring about any reservations because these are enabling provisions. Now, why I find this to be problematic is because for decades now, since the case of N.M. Thomas, the Supreme Court has discarded this very formal understanding of equality. Because equality does not mean treating unequals equally. The Supreme Court has accepted the principle that reservations are not an exception to equality of opportunity, but are part and parcel of equality of opportunity under Article 16(1). And if that is so, then the question that one must ask oneself is that can a mandamus not lie against the government? Can there be no fundamental right to reservations if reservations are a part of equality of opportunity as opposed to being an exception to the principle of equality of opportunity? So this is quite an interesting domain, and I think we might see some interesting law being laid down in coming years, or at least one would hope that there would be some interesting law laid down in the constitution benches that are coming up in the coming years. Thank you so much.
Do we have any more questions from the participants? Very well. Now I request Mr. Bhanu Kumar to kindly convey the vote of thanks to Dr. Abhinav Chandrachud for this splendid evening, for this enlightening evening.
Mr. Rahul, if I may, I just posted a question on the comments.
Pranay Modi. Yes, I just read it aloud to Abhinav. This is a question by Pranay Modi. He puts a question that Article 15(4) allows the state to make any special provision for the advancement of. Does anything in your research indicate that this phrase was meant to co-opt affirmative action in forms other than reservations?
So thank you, Pranay, for that question. That is a very interesting question. And in fact, it has been sought to be argued before the Supreme Court many times that because the terminology or the phraseology under Article 15(4) is different from that under Article 16(4), there cannot be any quotas in educational institutions. Now, mind you, in the US, the system of affirmative action that is followed in the US is very different, where at educational institutions in the US, there can be no quota. A quota is declared unconstitutional there, but diversity in diversity in the form of, say, racial diversity is one of the factors that can be taken into account by a university while granting admission to a candidate. So similarly, it has been sought to be argued in India that since there is no reservation specifically referred to in Article 15(4) of the Constitution, the term does not include reservations. The Supreme Court has, of course, rejected that argument and said that special provision includes not merely things like concessions, relaxations, but it also includes reservations. And in my research, I would say that this provision was really brought about with Dr. Ambedkar being the law minister. And it was very much in the minds of the first parliament, of the provisional parliament, that there should be reservations in educational institutions. In fact, the first amendment was enacted in order to overrule, so to speak, the judgment of the Supreme Court in Champakam Doirarajan's case, which really said that it is doubtful whether there can be reservations in educational institutions, as there is no provision comparable to Article 16(4), which creates an exception to Article 29(2). So if you look at the contemporaneous evidence and the manner in which the first Parliament of India was interpreting the provision, it is quite clear that by special provision, they meant to have a policy of reservations, and that is certainly how the Supreme Court has in fact interpreted the provision.
Thank you, Dr. Chandrasood.
Thank you.
Just one more question.
Yes.
How do you view this situation that, am I audible?
Yes, Mr. Neeraj Bhai. Please.
Yeah. How do you view this situation in Jarnail Singh, the 5 judges calling the previous 5 judges' judgment in M. Nagaraj as not a good law?
So that is very interesting. I have, of course, recently written a piece that was posted on Live Law, where I have taken the view that I think a large amount of time is wasted in constituting larger benches. I think that when a constitution bench is deciding a case and hearing a case concerning a coordinate bench, there is no reason why, akin to jurisdictions the world over, like the US Supreme Court or the UK Supreme Court, a bench of coordinate strength should not be able to overrule a bench of coordinate strength. And the example that I've given is that the judgment of the Supreme Court in Chinnaya's case was decided by a unanimous decision. It was all 5 judges holding a certain way. Now that judgment has been referred to a bench of 7 learned judges of the Supreme Court, who can by a majority of 4-3 overrule Chinnaya's case. So in other words, it will take only 4 judges to overrule a bench of 5 judges in the subsequently constituted larger bench. And the Chinnaya judgment was referred to 5 judges in 2014. It has now taken 6 years for the court in Dalvinder Singh to make a further reference to a larger bench. The question is, will it take another 6 years for E.V. Chinnaya to be reconsidered? So a large amount of time goes to waste. I will only say this about Jarnail Singh. It's very interesting. The Supreme Court says that the exercise that Nagaraj contemplated, that there must be a data collection and quantitative data must be collected to show that the backward communities are in fact backward. Jarnail Singh says that that does not apply to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes who are presumed to be backward. Now, after the 102nd Amendment to the Constitution, Article 342A has been inserted into the Constitution, which contemplates a central list of OBCs or socially and educationally backward classes. So in the coming years, I would anticipate that the same principle laid down in Jarnail Singh would also apply to the communities who have been listed out under Article 342A of the Constitution. And the Supreme Court would probably say, extending the logic of Jarnail Singh, that if a community is set out in the list under Article 342A, then it is presumed to be backward and no data collection exercise needs to be carried out. This is something that would perhaps one would anticipate.
That was a great point. In fact, we get a hint to argue this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now we have the last question of the evening from Acha. Yes,
Hi,
Yoshita,
Abhinav.
please.
Thank you for the wonderful speech. Abhinav, I had a question deviating from your topic, a little deviation. You must be aware of the ad hoc policy. that was for 10 years, initially for reservation policy. Right? Reservations were given for 10 years initially.
Yes, yes.
Because we were of the view that the trickle down theory would take care of other things later on. But we see that there is a failure, total failure of the trickle down theory. What factors do you think will be attributable to such failure?
So it's quite interesting. The Pune Pact did not contemplate that there would be an end or there would be a sunset when it comes to reservations in the political sphere. The Pune Pact did not say that reservations in the political sphere would come to an end in 10 years. And in fact, I believe that the agreement was that it would only come to an end when all sides were really agreed that it should come to an end. And in fact, if you look at the practice of it, that is precisely what has happened. Though the Constitution says that political reservations must extend for a period of 10 years, that sunset has been extended every 10 years by virtue of a constitutional amendment. I would, of course, argue that that gives effect to the Pune Pact, which was the agreement that was entered into between Dr. Ambedkar and Gandhi. On the trickle down, I have only one thing to say, which another argument that I find quite interesting, which is that if you look at one of Justice K.G. Balakrishnan's judgments, when his lordship was considering the constitutionality of one of the amendments made to the constitution, which brought about OBC reservation in panchayats. And the argument was whether the creamy layer concept ought to apply to political reservations as well. Mind you, Justice Balakrishnan said that no, the creamy layer should not be excluded from OBCs when it comes to political reservations in panchayats and so on, unlike in the educational sphere. And the answer that Justice Balakrishnan gave was that, well, reservations in the political sphere are meant to benefit not merely the candidate in question, but also the community at large, what you would call the trickle-down theory. So in other words, if a person is elected to a reserved seat, then that person benefits the entire community, and it is not only that candidate who is benefited, and therefore the creamy layer should not be excluded from political reservations. That is the ratio of the Supreme Court. Now, I would argue that this principle would also apply to government departments and to educational institutions. The example that I gave you of doctors, for instance, if a member from a scheduled caste or scheduled tribe or OBC becomes a doctor, it is not merely that person and that person's immediate family who are benefited, but also the community at large, because that community, through their social networks, now have access to a doctor. And so really, if the creamy layer should not be excluded in the sphere of political reservations on the trickle-down theory, then the question is, why should that theory also not apply under Article 15.4 and 16.4? So these are again interesting issues that we may see, or one would anticipate in the near future.
Yes, now,
Rahul, though we are exceeding
Yes.
time, it appears, but may I just put one question which
Yes,
is haunting
yes,
in my
please.
mind
yes, please.
throughout my whole career as a lawyer, as a citizen also, that Mr. Chanchud, don't you think that now this reservation aspect is just a vote bank politics and nothing more? It really does not benefit the actual needy persons. It is just a vote bank politics, nothing more. Just short question.
So thank you for that question. It is a question that needs to be addressed. And in fact, I did have some, if you will permit me, if you will indulge me only for a minute.
Yes.
If you look at the statistics, and these are statistics from the 2011 census, you find that scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in particular lag behind the rest of the country on social factors. So for instance, scheduled caste and scheduled tribe babies are born with a lower average weight, and they are shorter than general category children. Between 36% and 39% of scheduled castes are below the poverty line, as opposed to 16% of the general population. Scheduled castes and scheduled tribes are less literate than the general population. They drop out from school more often than the general population. They have lesser access to assets such as drinking water, toilets, electricity, banks, television, even the internet. Despite the policy of reservations, scheduled caste communities have not been able to percolate into the highest levels of government service. And scheduled tribes, in fact, have not even been able to percolate at the mid-tier of government service, according to the census of 2011. Scheduled castes and scheduled tribes are unable to enroll, or they enroll in professional schools like medicine, engineering, and law at a much lower rate than the general population. So it certainly is true that scheduled castes and scheduled tribes are communities that are marginalized and desperately in need of assistance. I would perhaps agree with the argument that there is a great amount of emphasis or public attention on affirmative action or reservations, whereas perhaps other measures are more important and more necessary to uplift the condition of the backward classes. And I'll only give you some statistics. 9.5% of Indians over the age of 20 are educated at the university level, of whom 4.8% are scheduled caste and 3.1% are scheduled tribe. And only 4.8% Indians between the ages of 20 and 59 are actually employed in the public sector. So when we talk about reservations, we are actually talking about a very tiny minority of the population. The policy of reservations affects, in very direct terms, a very small minority of the population. I'm of course not on the trickle-down theory. So a great amount of public attention goes into reservations, though perhaps we need to focus more on social factors and on the social amelioration of the backward communities. So thank you for that question.
Thanks.
Thank you, Abhinav, for answering the queries of all the participants of this webinar. Now I request Mr. Bhanu Kumar, Advocate, Jharkhand High Court, to kindly convey the vote of thanks to our guest speaker, Dr. Abhinav Chandrachud.
Thank you, Rahul. We are very happy today, and we extend our thanks to Dr. Abhinav for delivering a very fine speech, lecture, and the evolution and concept of how the castes, SC, ST, OBC, concept of depressed classes, untouchability, how class was imported from UK, how middle class is known as OBC in UK, and here they are backward class. What is the difference between class and caste? The Pune Pact, and then the important provisions of Indian Constitution, 16(4), Article 332, then the Sunset Clause and various committees, Kaka Kalelkar Committee and the famous Mandal Commission, and then some of the landmark judgments which held the field for many years. M.R. Balaji case delivered by Justice Gajendra Gadkar, and Indra Sawhney case, and then the recent judgments of Nagraj, Jarnail Singh, etc. We are really startled, Dr. Abhinav, that you are having a very elephantine memory, if I say so, and all data on your fingertips. You have, in a very nice and lucid manner, you have spelled the organic evolution of caste, the historical background of reservation. It is very, very highly research oriented, and of course, a rich legacy of 3 generations has contributed, and your excellent academic background also. And the most amazing thing is that you gave your lecture in an extempore manner. That was most surprising. We are used to hearing lectures from some piece of paper and documents, but you in an extempore manner delivered your speech. I had occasion to hear you on YouTube also, and every time you really, you are very impressive. So, Dr. Abhinav, we thank you a lot for sparing your precious time, and we offer our best wishes for a bright future. And we wish that you may time and again, after an interval of a month or two, will be enlightening us on many other specific. This topic was very conceptual, but the lawyers, young lawyers, they need some practical tips also. And as you gave the example, how to find out the ratio in Indra Sawhney case, para 555, that technique and that trick of the trade we also want to learn, especially our junior colleagues. So on behalf of all the advocates of Jharkhand High Court, we extend our warmest thanks. And again, I thank the participants, especially the chairman, Mr. Rajendra, chairman of our Bar Council of Jharkhand, Mr. Rajendra Krishna, Mr. Manoj Tandon, ex-additional advocate general, other senior advocates, and all the participants and colleagues. And lastly, I offer my thanks to Mr. Rahul Sabu, who is instrumental in organizing such illuminating webinars, which is a blessing for us in this time of pandemic. We are utilizing in a very creative way. And so lastly, once again, we are wishing best wishes for a bright and illustrious future. Thank you, Dr. Abhinav.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abhinav. Thank you so much.
Thank you.